They say if a man catches a warrior's arrow, he doesn't just stop death, he steals a destiny. The wind moved first, dry and restless, carrying dust through the narrow canyon like whispers no one wanted to hear. Ayana Redbird stood high on the ridge, bow drawn, breath steady, her fingers firm against the string as if they had never known hesitation. Below her, Ethan Cole rode alone, a single figure cutting through Apache land like he didn't understand the weight of where his boots had taken him. The sun hung low, sharp and unforgiving, turning the rocks into mirrors of heat, and still he didn't look up. Maybe he felt it, that quiet shift in the air when a decision has already been made. Maybe he didn't. Ayana released the arrow. It moved fast, slicing the space between them with a sound too thin to hear, but too real to ignore. Ethan turned. Not fast, not panicked, just enough. His hand came up, rough and steady. And somehow the world slowed long enough for leather, wood, and instinct to meet in one impossible moment. The arrow stopped, not in the ground, not in flesh, but in his hand. Silence followed, thick and unnatural. Even the wind seemed to step back. Ethan looked at what he held like it didn't belong to him, like it had chosen the wrong man. Above him, Ayana's breath caught, not from fear, but from something deeper, something older than either of them. No one caught a warrior's arrow. No one lived in that space between intention and consequence. And yet here he was. The first warrior appeared behind her, then another, then more, shapes forming out of stone and shadow until the ridge was no longer empty. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The law had already spoken long before any of them were born. Ethan felt them before he saw them. That quiet pressure that comes when you are no longer alone, when eyes settle on you like weight. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't move at all, just stood there, the arrow still in his grip, as if letting go might break something he didn't understand yet. Ayana lowered her bow slowly, her eyes locked on him, searching for something that would make sense of what had just happened. Anger was there, sharp and immediate, but beneath it, confusion, and beneath that, something she refused to name. You shouldn't have done that, she said, her voice carrying down the canyon, steady but tight at the edges. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, glancing up at her with a calm that didn't match the moment. Didn't look like I had much choice, he answered, his tone low, almost quiet, like he was speaking to himself more than to her. A murmur moved through the warriors behind her, not loud, not chaotic, just enough to ripple the stillness. They knew what this meant. She knew what this meant. Ethan didn't. Not yet. Ayana stepped forward, each movement measured, controlled, like she was walking into something she couldn't step out of. The feathers tied near the end of the arrow shifted slightly in Ethan's hand as the breeze returned, brushing against his fingers like a reminder. That arrow, she said, her voice lower now, was not meant to be held. Ethan looked at it again, turning it slightly, noticing the details he'd missed, the careful carving, the worn polish where fingers had touched it 100 times before. It wasn't just a weapon. It was something else, something carried, something chosen. Then maybe you shouldn't have sent it my way, he replied, not harsh, not mocking, just honest in a way that felt out of place here. Another ripple through the ridge. The oldest of the warriors stepped forward, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. He didn't look at Ethan first. He looked at Ayana. Something passed between them. Understanding, history, weight. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted down. Ethan met it without flinching, not defiant, not submissive, just steady. The old man nodded once, almost to himself, as if confirming something no one else could see. It is done, he said, his voice carrying without effort, settling into the canyon like it belonged there. Ethan frowned slightly, the words not quite landing. What is? He asked. No one answered right away. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of rules, of stories, of consequences that had been waiting for a moment like this. Ayana's jaw tightened. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him now, as if trying to decide whether he was a man or a mistake. You took what was not yours, she said. Ethan's grip loosened slightly around the arrow, not dropping it, but feeling its weight more clearly now. I caught it, he said, quieter this time. That's all. Ayana shook her head once slow. No, she said. and there was something final in it. Not all. The wind picked up again, carrying dust between them, blurring the space just enough to make everything feel less certain. Ethan stood there, the arrow still in his hand, the eyes of a people on his back, and for the first time since the moment it all changed, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. The arrow did not feel lighter in Ethan Cole's hand as the moment stretched. It felt heavier, as if every eye on that ridge had added weight to it, as if it carried something more than wood and feather, something older than the canyon itself. The old warrior stepped down first, slow and deliberate, his boots finding each stone like he had walked this path 100 times before, and the others followed without sound, forming a quiet line that moved toward Ethan without threat yet without invitation. Ethan did not step back, though every instinct he had learned from years alone told him distance meant survival. Instead, he stood where he was, shoulders squared, not in defiance, not in surrender, just in place. Ayanna descended last, her gaze never leaving him, her presence sharper now, closer, no longer a figure on a ridge but a force standing within reach. When she stopped a few feet away, the space between them felt narrower than it should have, filled with something unspoken that neither of them could ignore. "Give it back," she said, extending her hand, palm steady, fingers open. Ethan looked at the arrow, then at her hand, then back at her face, searching for something that would make this simple. "If I do," he asked quietly, "does it change anything?" A flicker crossed her eyes, quick and gone, but enough to tell him the answer before she spoke. "No," she said. The words settled between them like dust after a storm. Ethan exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not angry, just aware now that whatever line he had crossed could not be stepped back over. He placed the arrow gently into her hand, careful, almost respectful, like returning something that had never belonged to him. Ayanna closed her fingers around it, but she did not lower her hand right away, as if holding it too loosely might undo what had already been set in motion. Behind her, the old warrior spoke again, his voice low but carrying. "The law does not break because we wish it." Ethan glanced past her toward the man, then back again. "And what exactly is that law?" he asked. No one answered immediately, but the silence itself seemed to shape the meaning. Ayanna finally lowered her hand, the arrow now resting against her side, and she took a breath that did not quite steady her. "A warrior does not loose an arrow without purpose," she said. "If another takes it before it finds its mark, he takes that purpose with it." Ethan frowned slightly, the words forming something he almost understood but not entirely. "Purpose is not something you can hand over," he said. "Not like this." Ayanna's jaw tightened, not at his words, but at how easily he spoke them. "You do not understand," she replied. "It is not about what you believe." Ethan let out a quiet breath, glancing briefly at the canyon walls, at the sky stretching above them, at everything that suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago. "Then explain it to me," he said. The old warrior stepped closer, his presence drawing the air tighter. "You stopped what was already chosen," he said. "Now you stand where that choice leads." Ethan held his gaze, steady, unflinching, but inside something shifted, something that told him this was not a conversation he could win with reason alone. Ayanna looked away for the first time, just briefly, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something that was no longer there. When she looked back, there was less anger in her expression, but more weight. "You should not have been here," she said. Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was the first thing that made sense. "That seems to be the one thing we agree on," he answered. A faint movement passed through the warriors. Not quite approval, not quite disapproval, just acknowledgement. The old man nodded once, then turned slightly, signaling without words. The line of warriors shifted, opening a path that led deeper into the canyon. Ethan noticed it immediately, the way space was being made not for escape, but for direction. "You are coming with us," the old warrior said. It was not a command spoken with force, but it carried the same weight. Ethan looked at Ayanna, not at the warriors, as if her answer mattered more than theirs. She did not meet his eyes this time. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the arrow, her fingers tightening just enough to show that whatever she felt, she was holding it in place. You have already stepped into this, she said quietly. Walking away will not change it. Ethan let the words settle, feeling the truth in them even if he did not accept it. He glanced toward his horse, still waiting a short distance away, reins loose, unaware that its rider's path had shifted. For a moment, the world offered him a simple choice. Ride away, leave this behind, let their laws remain theirs. But the arrow had already been in his hand. The moment had already passed. He turned back to Ayanna, then to the path ahead, then finally to the old warrior. Then lead the way, he said. It was not surrender. It was not agreement. It was something quieter, something heavier, the kind of choice a man makes when he knows there is no clean way out. Ayanna stepped forward first, not waiting to see if he would follow. She already knew. The warriors moved with her, forming a silent procession into the narrowing canyon. Ethan hesitated only long enough to take one last look at the open land behind him, the wide sky, the distance that used to belong to him. Then he stepped forward, leaving it there without a word, the sound of his boots against stone the only thing marking that something had changed. And as the canyon closed in around them, the light dimming just enough to feel it, Ethan understood one more thing he had not known before. Whatever waited at the end of this path was not something he could outrun, because it was already walking beside him. The canyon narrowed as they walked, the walls rising higher with every step, cutting the sky into a thin line of pale blue that seemed too far away to matter. The air cooled slightly, carrying the scent of dry stone and distant smoke, and the sound of boots against gravel echoed just enough to remind Ethan that he was no longer alone with his own thoughts. Ayanna walked ahead, her pace steady, her posture unyielding, as if the path itself belonged to her, and she had no intention of sharing it. Ethan followed a few feet behind, not close enough to challenge, not far enough to pretend distance still existed between them. The warriors moved around them in silence, their presence constant but never intrusive, like shadows that chose where to fall. No one spoke, and the silence began to take shape, stretching into something that pressed against the edges of Ethan's mind. After a while, he noticed small things, the way Ayanna adjusted her grip on the arrow without looking, the way her steps avoided loose stones without hesitation, the way the others followed her lead without question. This was not just movement. It was structure, something practiced, something lived. Ethan glanced at the canyon walls again, then at the narrow path ahead, and finally at the arrow still in her hand. It had not left her grip once. You hold on to it like it might disappear, he said, his voice low enough not to carry beyond her. Ayanna did not slow, did not turn, but she heard him. It does not disappear, she replied. It remembers. Ethan let that settle for a moment, unsure if she meant the arrow or something else entirely. What does it remember? He asked. Ayanna finally glanced back, just briefly, her eyes meeting his with a look that held more than one answer. Who chose it? She said. Then she faced forward again. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting ahead, trying to piece together a logic that did not follow the rules he knew. The path curved, opening slightly into a wider stretch where the ground flattened and the light returned just enough to soften the shadows. A small stream cut through the stone, no more than a few feet across, its surface catching the sun in broken reflections. Ayanna stepped over it without pause, but Ethan stopped for a second, crouching just enough to let his fingers brush the water. It was cold, clear, steady, something about it felt real in a way the rest of this did not. He stood again and crossed, catching up without being told. You could still leave, Ayanna said suddenly, her voice quieter now, almost lost in the sound of water behind them. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the words. I thought we already settled that, he said. She shook her head slightly, not turning. No, she said. We only settled that you followed. Ethan considered that, his steps slowing just a fraction. And if I stop following? He asked. Ayanna paused then, just long enough to break the rhythm of her movement, but not long enough to fully turn. Then you walk back into a world that does not know what you carry, she said. And that world will still not change what has been done. Ethan frowned slightly, looking past her toward the open stretch ahead. You talk like this is something I chose, he said. Ayanna turned this time, fully, facing him, her expression no longer guarded by distance. You chose to stay, she said. The words were not harsh, not accusing, just certain. Ethan held her gaze, the weight of that truth settling deeper than he expected. He could have left. He had not. The old warrior's voice carried from behind them, calm and steady. Choice is not always where a man begins, but it is where he stands. Ethan glanced back briefly, then forward again, letting the words sit without argument. The group moved on, the canyon slowly giving way to a broader valley where the land opened just enough to breathe. The sky widened, the light softened, and in the distance, faint shapes began to take form, structures low to the ground, smoke rising in thin lines, movement that spoke of life rather than passage. Ethan slowed, taking it in. The first real sign of where this path led, Ayanna watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the shift, the way his attention moved from the ground to the horizon. That is where we are going, she said. Ethan nodded once, his gaze fixed ahead. I figured as much, he replied. They walked a few more steps in silence before he spoke again, quieter now. What happens when we get there? Ayanna's grip on the arrow tightened slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt. She did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it that had not been there before. You will be seen, she said. Ethan almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but out of recognition. I already am, he said. Ayanna shook her head once slow. Not like this, she replied. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of smoke more clearly now, the sound of distant voices just beginning to rise. Ethan looked ahead, then back at her, then at the arrow. And you? He asked. What happens to you? Ayanna held his gaze for a moment, longer than before, her eyes steady but not as guarded. I already know, she said. Then she turned and kept walking, leaving the answer behind her, and Ethan followed. Because whatever waited in that valley was no longer something either of them could avoid. The valley did not announce itself with noise. It revealed itself slowly, like something that had always been there waiting to be noticed. The land opened wide, stretching out in soft curves of dry grass and scattered brush, and at its center, the village stood quiet but alive. Low structures built from earth and wood, smoke rising in thin steady lines that carried the scent of fire and something cooking far off. Ethan slowed without meaning to, his steps losing their rhythm. As his eyes took in the details, the movement of people, the shapes of daily life that felt both familiar and entirely foreign. Ayanna did not slow, but she felt it, the shift in him, the way his attention changed from the path beneath his boots to the lives ahead of him. The warriors fanned out slightly as they approached, not in formation, but in purpose, each one stepping into a place that seemed already decided. Voices began to fade as they entered the outer edge of the village. Conversations quieting, movements pausing, eyes turning. No one rushed forward, no one spoke out. But the awareness spread like a ripple through still water. Ethan felt it settle on him, not sharp, not hostile, just present, like being measured without a word being said. Ayanna stepped into that silence like it belonged to her, her shoulders straight, her pace unchanged, the arrow still in her hand as if it had become part of her. A child paused near one of the low walls, watching them with wide eyes before being gently guided back by an older woman whose gaze lingered a moment longer on Ethan. He noticed the details then, the patterns woven into clothing, the marks of use on tools set aside, the quiet order that held everything together without needing to be spoken. This was not a place waiting for him. It was a place that existed entirely without him. Do not speak unless you are spoken to, Ayanna said under her breath, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Ethan glanced at her, then nodded once, not out of obedience, but understanding. Some places had rules that were not written down. They moved deeper into the village, the ground packed firm beneath their boots, the air warmer here, touched by the presence of fire and people. At the center stood a larger structure, simple but deliberate, its position alone marking its importance. The old warrior moved ahead of them, his steps carrying a quiet authority that shifted the space around him. When he stopped, the others did as well, forming a loose circle that did not close in, but did not leave open either. Ayanna stepped forward, just one pace, and Ethan felt the distance between them change again, not in feet, but in meaning. A figure emerged from the shade of the central structure, older than the others, his hair streaked with gray, his posture upright despite the years that had shaped him. He did not hurry, did not raise his voice, but when he stopped, the entire space seemed to settle around him. His eyes moved first to Ayanna, then to the arrow in her hand, and finally to Ethan. The look was not harsh, not welcoming, just steady, as if he had been expecting something like this without knowing when it would arrive. "You return with more than you left with," he said, his voice even, carrying just enough to be heard by all. Ayanna inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "The path changed," she replied. The man's gaze shifted again, lingering on Ethan now, measuring, weighing. "So it did," he said. Silence followed. But it was not empty. It was full of attention, of listening, of waiting for something that had not yet been spoken aloud. Ethan stood where he was, aware of every eye, of every breath, of the way the moment stretched without breaking. He did not look away, but he did not challenge the gaze either. He simply remained. The man nodded once, then stepped closer, just enough to shorten the space between them. "You understand why you are here?" he asked. Ethan considered the question, not rushing to answer, not pretending to know more than he did. "I understand that something happened," he said slowly. "I am still learning what it means." A faint shift passed through those gathered. Not quite surprise, not quite approval, just a recognition of honesty where something else might have been expected. The man's expression did not change, but his eyes held Ethan's a moment longer. "Meaning is not given all at once," he said. "It is carried, piece by piece." Ayanna's grip on the arrow tightened slightly, her eyes fixed ahead, her posture still, but not as untouched as before. The man turned to her then, his gaze softer, but no less serious. "And you?" he asked. Ayanna lifted her chin just a fraction, enough to meet his eyes fully. "I know what the law says," she answered. The words were steady, but there was something beneath them now, something that had not been there on the ridge. The man studied her, then the arrow, then Ethan again. "Knowing is not the same as accepting," he said. Ayanna did not respond, but the silence she gave held more than words could have. The wind moved through the village, light but present, carrying the scent of smoke and earth between them. Ethan felt it brush against his face, grounding him in a moment that felt both immediate and inevitable. The man stepped back slightly, his gaze moving over the gathered people before returning to the two of them. "Then we will not rush what must be understood," he said. "You will stay." The words settled with quiet finality, not as a command, but as a statement of what already was. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of that settling into him without resistance. Ayanna did not move, but her hand lowered just enough for the arrow to rest against her side once more. And in that small motion, something shifted, not in the eyes of the others, but in the space between them, a space that had begun with a single impossible moment, and had now brought them both to a place where neither could pretend it had not happened. The fire burned low that night, not weak, not fading, just steady, like something that had learned patience over time. Ethan sat a few feet from it, his back straight against a rough wooden post, his hat resting beside him in the dust, untouched since he arrived. The village had quieted, not completely, but enough that every sound carried farther than it should, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional crack of wood shifting in flame, the distant rhythm of someone moving through the dark. It was not silence, but it was close. Ayanna stood on the other side of the fire, the light catching the edge of her face, leaving the rest in shadow, her posture unchanged from the moment they had entered this place, as if stillness was something she wore as much as she held. The arrow was still in her hand. Ethan noticed that before anything else, it had not been set aside, not leaned against anything, not placed with the others. It remained with her, as if letting it go would change more than she was willing to risk. "Do you ever put that down?" he asked, his voice low, not sharp, just cutting through the quiet between them. Ayanna did not answer right away. She looked at the fire instead, watching the way the flames moved without pattern, then finally, she spoke. "Not tonight," she said. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze steady but not pressing. "Because of me?" he asked. Ayanna's eyes shifted to him then, holding his for a moment longer than before. "Because of what happened," she said. The distinction was small, but it mattered. Ethan nodded once, accepting it without argument. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that moved across their faces in slow, uneven patterns, like the moment itself did not want to settle into something simple. "You could have told them it was nothing," he said after a while. "That it did not mean what they think it means." Ayana's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did, something sharper, something closer to frustration. "And you think they would believe that?" she asked. Ethan considered it, then shook his head slightly. "No," he admitted, "but it would have been something." Ayana stepped closer to the fire, the light catching more of her now, revealing the tension she had been holding beneath that still surface. "There are things that are not undone by words," she said. "Only by time, or not at all." Ethan let that settle, the weight of it finding its place somewhere he did not quite want to look at yet. A log shifted in the fire, sending a brief flare of sparks upward before they faded into the night. Neither of them moved. "So what happens now?" he asked, quieter this time. Ayana looked down at the arrow, her fingers tracing the worn wood without thinking, following lines that had been carved long before this moment existed. "Now," she said slowly, "we wait." Ethan almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it felt like the kind of answer that avoided more than it revealed. "Waiting has never been my strength," he said. Ayana's lips pressed together slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite anything else. "Then you will learn," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried something beneath them, something that felt less like instruction and more like inevitability. Ethan leaned back again, his shoulders settling against the post, his gaze lifting briefly to the sky above, where the stars had begun to show through the darkness, scattered and distant. He had spent years under that same sky, alone, free in a way he had thought was permanent. Now it looked the same, but it did not feel the same. "You said the arrow remembers," he said after a moment. Ayana's attention shifted back to him, quiet, waiting. "What happens if it remembers wrong?" he asked. Ayana shook her head once, slow and certain. "It does not remember wrong," she said. "People do." Ethan let out a breath, the answer settling heavier than he expected. He looked at the arrow again, then at her. "And what does it say about me?" he asked. Ayana held his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then something softened, just enough to notice. "It says you stood where you should not have stood," she said. "And you did not step away when you could have." Ethan nodded slightly, accepting that without defense. "That does not sound like a reason for anything good," he said. Ayana's grip on the arrow shifted again, not tightening, not loosening, just adjusting, like she was finding a place for it that felt right. "It is not about good," she said. "It is about what follows." The fire crackled again, a low steady sound that filled the space between them without interrupting it. Ethan watched her for a long moment, not trying to read her, not trying to solve anything, just seeing her as she was in that moment. "And what do you want it to be?" he asked finally. The question hung there, simple but heavier than anything that had been said before. Ayana did not answer right away. She looked at the fire, then at the ground, then back at him. For a moment, the certainty that had followed her all day seemed to shift, not breaking, but bending just enough to let something else through. "What I want does not change what is," she said. But her voice was quieter now, less certain than before. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her in the flickering light. "Sometimes it does," he said. Ayana held his gaze, and this time she did not look away. The silence stretched again, but it felt different now, less like distance, more like something waiting to be understood. Somewhere in the village, a voice called softly, then faded. The night continued, steady and patient, and between them, the arrow remained. Not just a piece of wood and feather, but a line neither of them had crossed before, and neither of them yet knew how to step away from morning came without announcement. Just a slow change in the color of the sky, the darkness thinning into pale blue, while the fire settled into quiet ash. Ethan woke before the sun cleared the horizon, not because he had rested well, but because something in him refused to stay still in a place that was not his. The ground beneath him was firm, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dust that had not yet been stirred by the day. He sat up slowly, his movements measured, his eyes scanning the village as it began to wake. Figures moved in the distance, quiet and purposeful, as if each person already knew where they needed to be before the day had even begun. There was no rush, no loud voices, just a rhythm that did not belong to him. Ayana was already awake. She stood near the edge of the fire's remains, the arrow still in her hand, though now it rested lower, closer to her side, as if the weight of holding it had become something she no longer questioned. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you ever sleep?" he asked. His voice was calm, but it carried the rough edge of someone not used to being observed in the quiet hours. Ayana did not turn right away. She looked toward the horizon where the first light touched the tops of the hills. Then finally she answered. "Enough," she said. Ethan let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it did not quite reach that. "That does not sound like much," he said. Ayana turned then, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. "It is what is needed," she replied. Ethan nodded slightly, pushing himself to his feet, brushing dust from his clothes with slow, habitual movements. He reached for his hat, settling it back onto his head, the familiar weight grounding him in a way the rest of this place did not. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not the same as before. It had shifted, not softer, but less distant, as if something had been acknowledged without being named. A young boy passed nearby, carrying a small bundle of wood, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan before moving on. Ethan noticed it, the way curiosity lingered even when it was not spoken. "They all know," he said quietly. Ayana followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "They all see," she corrected. Ethan considered that, then nodded once. "That feels like the same thing," he said. Ayana shook her head slightly. "It is not," she replied. "Seeing does not mean understanding." Ethan let that settle, his eyes drifting across the village again, taking in the movement, the quiet structure of it. "All. And do they understand?" he asked. Ayana's grip on the arrow shifted slightly, not tightening, but not relaxing either. "They understand the law," she said. "That is enough for them." Ethan looked back at her, studying her expression, searching for something beneath the words. "And for you?" he asked. Ayana did not answer immediately. She looked at the arrow, her fingers brushing along its length in a motion that seemed more familiar than conscious. "For me," she said slowly, "it is not enough." The admission hung between them, quiet but unmistakable. Ethan did not react right away. He simply watched her, taking in the difference in her voice, the way certainty had begun to fracture just enough to let something else through. "Then why follow it?" he asked. Ayana lifted her eyes to his, her gaze steady, but not as closed as before. "Because it is not only mine to break," she said. Ethan exhaled slowly, the answer settling into place with a weight that felt both reasonable and impossible at the same time. A figure approached from across the village, the same older man from the night before, his steps unhurried, his presence carrying that same quiet authority that seemed to shape the space around him. The movement drew Ayana's attention first, then Ethan's. The man stopped a few feet from them, his eyes moving between the two, taking in the distance, the posture, the unspoken tension that still lingered. "You have rested," he said. It was not a question. Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Enough," he replied, echoing Ayana's earlier word without meaning to. Something almost like approval passed through the man's expression, though it was gone before it could be named. "Then you will walk," he said. Ethan frowned slightly. "Walk where?" he asked. The man's gaze shifted toward the far edge of the village, where the land rose again into low hills. "To understand what you now carry," he said. Ethan glanced briefly at Ayana, then back at the man. "I thought that was already decided," he said. The man shook his head once, slow. "Nothing is decided until it is lived," he replied. Ayana stepped forward then, not waiting to be told, her movement immediate, certain. Ethan watched her for a moment, then followed, because that seemed to be the only direction left. As they walked away from the center of the village, the sounds behind them faded again, replaced by the quiet of open land, the crunch of dry earth beneath their boots, the low whisper of wind moving through grass. Ethan looked ahead, then at Ayana, then at the arrow. "What happens on this walk?" he asked. Ayana did not slow, did not turn. You see what cannot be explained, she said. Ethan almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to show he had heard it. That sounds like the kind of thing I am not going to like, he said. Ayana's expression did not change, but there was something there now, something less rigid than before. That does not matter, she replied. Ethan nodded once, accepting it, not because he agreed, but because he understood that agreement was no longer the point. The land stretched ahead of them, open and quiet, and as they walked into it, Ethan felt something shift again, not in the world around him, but in the way he stood within it. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, it was no longer something happening to him. It was something he had stepped into, and now, whether he wanted it or not, he was going to have to see it through. The land beyond the village did not change quickly. It stretched outward in long, quiet lines, the ground dry and firm beneath their boots, the wind moving low across the grass like something that had nowhere else to be. Ethan walked beside Ayana now, not behind her, not ahead, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance, just something unspoken. The older man had stopped at the edge of the village, watching them go without a word, leaving the path ahead to the two of them alone. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was not heavy, but it was present, like a question waiting for someone to answer first. Ethan glanced at the arrow again, the way it rested in her hand, still held, still carried, as if it had become a part of her that could not be set down. So this is the part where I see what cannot be explained, he said finally, his voice calm, cutting through the quiet without breaking it. Ayana did not look at him, her eyes fixed ahead, her steps steady. This is the part where you stop trying to explain it, she replied. Ethan let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite frustration. That might take some getting used to, he said. Ayana's lips pressed together slightly, not a smile, but not entirely closed either. They walked a few more yards before the ground began to rise, the slope gentle at first, then more defined, leading them toward a ridge that overlooked the valley behind them. The sky stretched wide above, the sun higher now, casting long shadows that moved slowly with each step. When they reached the top, Ayana stopped. Ethan slowed beside her, following her gaze as it settled over the land they had just crossed. From here, the village looked smaller, quieter, almost hidden within the shape of the valley, as if it belonged to the land more than to the people within it. The smoke rose in thin lines, steady, unchanged. This is where it begins, Ayana said. Ethan looked at her, then back at the valley. It already began, he replied. Ayana shook her head slightly. That was the moment, she said. This is the understanding. Ethan folded his arms loosely, his eyes scanning the horizon, taking in the way the land stretched beyond what he could see. All right, he said. Then help me understand. Ayana lifted the arrow slightly, just enough for the light to catch along its edge, the wood smooth, the feathers worn but intact. This was not made for killing, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, his gaze shifting to the arrow. It looks like it could, he said. Ayana nodded once. It can, she replied. But that is not why it exists. Ethan studied it more closely now, seeing the details he had overlooked before, the care in its shape, the balance in its design. Then what is it for? He asked. Ayana hesitated for a moment. Not because she did not know, but because saying it out loud made it something he would carry too. It is for choosing, she said. Ethan frowned slightly, the words settling in a place he did not quite understand. Choosing what? He asked. Ayana met his gaze then, her expression steady, but no longer distant. Who stands with you? She said. The wind moved between them, soft but present, carrying the weight of her words across the space that remained. Ethan looked at the arrow again, then back at her. And you chose me? He asked. Ayana's jaw tightened, not at him, but at the truth of the question. No, she said. I chose my target. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that without argument. But I caught it, he said. Ayana's grip on the arrow shifted slightly, her fingers tightening just enough to show that the difference mattered. And now the choice has changed, she replied. Ethan let that settle, the meaning beginning to take shape, not fully, but enough to feel its edges. He looked back over the valley, then at her again. And what happens if I refuse that choice? He asked. Ayana held his gaze, her expression calm. But there was something beneath it now, something that did not want to be ignored. Then you refuse more than me, she said. Ethan tilted his. Wide and quiet. But it no longer felt like distance, it felt like something watching. Ayana lowered the arrow slightly, not releasing it, just shifting its weight as if her hand had begun to tire of holding what her mind refused to let go. Ethan noticed. He always noticed the small things. You do not trust yourself to put it down, he said, his voice steady, not accusing, just observing. Ayana exhaled slowly, the breath carrying more than it should. If I put it down, she said, then I have already decided. Ethan nodded once, understanding more than he wanted to. And you are not ready for that, he replied. Ayana looked at him then, directly, without the distance she had kept before. Are you? She asked. The question landed differently than the others. Not about law, not about tribe, but about him. Ethan held her gaze, his expression calm. But there was something deeper beneath it now, something that had not been there when he first stepped into this. No, he said. No. Hesitation, no attempt to make it easier than it was. Ayana studied him for a moment, as if weighing that honesty against everything else she knew. The wind shifted again, lifting a strand of her hair, carrying the scent of dust and sun-warmed earth between them. Then why are you still here? She asked. Ethan looked past her for a second, out toward the open land, the kind of land he had always known, the kind that never asked questions, never demanded anything in return. Because leaving would be easier, he said. Ayana frowned slightly, not understanding. Ethan looked back at her. And easy is not always right, he added. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but firm. Ayana's grip on the arrow loosened just a fraction, not enough to drop it, but enough to show that something inside her had shifted. You speak like someone who has already made his choice, she said. Ethan shook his head once. No, he replied. I speak like someone who knows he is not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them had said yet. Ayana turned away slightly, her gaze drifting back over the valley, her shoulders still straight, but not as rigid as before. Where I come from, she said slowly. A choice like this does not belong to one person. Ethan stepped closer then, not enough to invade her space, but enough that his presence was no longer something she could ignore. Where I come from, he said. A choice like this does not belong to anyone else. Ayana let out a quiet breath, something between frustration and something softer. Then one of us is going to lose, she said. Ethan looked at the arrow, then at her, then back to the horizon. Or one of us is going to learn, he replied. Ayana turned back to him, her eyes sharper now, searching. Learn what? She asked. Ethan held her gaze, steady, grounded. That there is more than one way to stand beside someone, he said. The wind moved again, stronger this time, carrying dust across the ridge, forcing both of them to blink against it. When it passed, the world seemed quieter than before. Ayana looked down at the arrow in her hand, really looked at it now, not as a symbol, not as a rule, but as something she was holding, something she could release. Her fingers tightened slightly, then loosened again. If I let this go, she said, her voice lower now, then I stand alone. Ethan shook his head, not forcefully, just certain. No, he said. You stand by yourself. Ayana frowned slightly at that, the difference subtle but not lost on her. Ethan continued, his voice calm. There is a difference between being alone and choosing your own ground. Ayana looked at him again, and this time there was no anger, no resistance, just something uncertain, something that had not been allowed space until now. And what if I choose wrong? She asked. The question was quiet, almost lost in the wind, but it carried more weight than anything she had said before. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the moment sit, let the question exist without rushing to fill it. Then he spoke. Then it is your mistake, he said, not someone else's rule. Ayana closed her eyes for a brief second, the words settling into something deeper than she expected. When she opened them again, the valley looked the same, the sky unchanged, but something inside her had shifted. The arrow in her hand felt different now, not lighter, but clearer, She took a slow breath, her fingers moving along the wood one more time. Ethan watched her, not pushing, not waiting, just present. The wind moved again, softer now, as if it had decided to leave them alone for a moment. And in that quiet, standing on the ridge between what was expected and what was possible, Ayanna began to understand that the choice she feared was not the one the law had given her, but the one she had been avoiding all along. The ridge held its silence a moment longer, as if the land itself was waiting to see what she would do next. Ayanna's fingers rested along the length of the arrow, no longer gripping, no longer resisting, just holding it in a way that felt different, like the weight had shifted from her hand into something deeper. Ethan did not move, not even a step, but there was a stillness in him now that matched hers, not tense, not uncertain, just present. The wind softened, carrying a faint warmth as the sun climbed higher, stretching the shadows shorter beneath their feet. Ayanna looked down at the arrow again, then slowly, almost without realizing it, she turned it in her hand, not as a weapon, not as a symbol, but as something she could choose what to do with. Ethan watched the motion, quiet, careful not to interrupt what he could feel was changing. When I was younger, Ayanna said, her voice low, almost thoughtful, I was told that this would decide everything for me. Ethan tilted his head slightly, listening. Who I stand beside, who stands beside me. What path I walk after that, she continued. Ethan nodded once. Sounds like a heavy thing to carry, he said. Ayanna let out a small breath, something between agreement and something else. It was not meant to feel heavy, she said. It was meant to feel certain. Ethan glanced out at the land, then back at her. Certainty usually is, he replied. Ayanna's lips pressed together slightly, not disagreeing, but not accepting it either. But this does not feel like certainty, she said. Ethan shook his head once, calm. No, he said. It feels like choice. The word lingered in the air, simple, but sharper than anything else that had been said. Ayanna's fingers tightened slightly around the arrow, not out of fear, but out of recognition. She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing something she had not allowed herself to see before. You are not supposed to be part of this, she said. Ethan gave a small nod. I figured that out, he replied. Ayanna took a step closer, not fully closing the space, but enough that the distance between them felt intentional now, not accidental. You do not belong to this land, she said. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. No, he said. But I am standing on it. The answer was simple, but it held something steady, something that did not ask for permission. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, the wind brushing lightly past them, the quiet of the valley stretching out behind. Most men would have left, she said. Ethan glanced briefly toward the horizon, then back at her. Most men were not here when that arrow was, he replied. Ayanna almost smiled at that. Just a fraction, just enough to soften the line of her expression before it settled again. The moment held, balanced, neither of them pushing it further. Then Ayanna did something small, but different. She lowered the arrow, not completely, but enough that it no longer stood between them at chest height, no longer a barrier, just something she carried at her side. Ethan noticed immediately. He always noticed. That looks different, he said quietly. Ayanna nodded once, her eyes still on him. It is, she replied. Ethan let out a slow breath, something easing in his posture that had been there since the canyon. Then what happens now? He asked. Ayanna looked past him for a moment, toward the land that stretched beyond the ridge, then back at him. Now, she said, I decide what it means. Ethan tilted his head slightly. And what does it mean? He asked. Ayanna hesitated, not because she did not know, but because saying it made it real. The wind shifted again, carrying a low sound from the valley, distant voices, movement, life continuing without them. She looked at the arrow, then back at Ethan. It means I am not choosing because of them, she said. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds like a start, he replied. Ayanna's gaze held his, steady, searching. And if I choose you? She asked. The question was not soft, not hesitant, just direct. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the warrior, not just the law, but the